Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our event titled Rethinking Zionism After Gaza. It's a huge honor to have Barnett Rubin with us on campus today. Barnett Rubin is a distinguished fellow at NYU's Center on International Cooperation, where he previously directed the Afghanistan-Pakistan regional program. He worked there for 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. From 1994 to 2000, he was the director of the Center for Preventative Action and the director of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Rubin was associate professor in political science, and director of the Center for the Study of Central Asia at Columbia University from 1990 to 1996. He's the author of several important books focusing on issues of peace and conflict and security in West Asia and South Asia. He also writes regularly on Israel-Palestine at the Appointed Times on Substack. Now, we've extended an invitation to Professor Rubin to talk about Zionism after Gaza, largely due to an important essay that I discovered just accidentally in the Boston Review last year called False Messiahs: How Zionism's Dream of Liberation Became Entangled with Colonialism. I've assigned that essay to my students. I encourage you to read it. I'm glad to see that some of my students are here today. Professor Rubin has also made an important contribution to the study of the Israel-Palestine conflict by virtue of his discovery of a very important original document. He doesn't want to lay claim to the discovery of the document, but I discovered the document through his work. And that document actually appears in Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. You can find this document on page 6 of the book in the introduction. It's a fascinating correspondence between the founding father of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, and Yusuf Dia, the former mayor of Jerusalem, who happens to be Rashid Khalidi's great-great-great-uncle. Rashid Khalidi happens to be speaking on his campus next month, so there's a great synergy between that book, that document, and the contribution that Professor Rubin has played. And in corresponding with him about that particular fascinating correspondence, he, I think, rightly observed that by reading that particular document and that exchange between a prominent Palestinian leader at the time and the founding father of modern Zionism, he said it's more insightful than reading hundreds of books that have been written on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I actually agree that's true. I encourage you to, read that particular section of Rashid Khalidi's book to see what Professor Rubin is referring to. So it's wonderful to have you today here, Barnett Rubin. Obviously, it's a dark and depressing time for our world, for this country, obviously, especially for the people of Gaza. We look forward to your presentation. Please join me in welcoming Barnett Rubin to Georgetown English.
I'm going to stand up here because I can look at the slides too. Well, thanks to Nader for inviting me. Actually, we first met on Twitter, but we got to know each other better thanks to Badr Khan, because he actually used to study in India with one of my old friends, and even when I finally met him after he was released, he told me that he reminded me that he had written me in 2015 about work on Afghanistan. So I wrote a profile of him, which was on my Substack, which you can see. But that this event evolved out of that, and then I really have to thank Jonathan Stupple for all the work he did putting this together on very short notice. There's some, this is a set of videos, and editing is not that professional, but it was all done off the cuff by him and me. So please use it. Now, Nader, the title was suggested by Nader, Rethinking Zionism After Gaza. But let me unpack that a bit, because as we were discussing earlier, the word Zionism means very different things to very different people, and its meaning has changed over time. Originally, it was a political movement that was founded in 19th century Europe, proposing that the solution to the Jewish problem or the Jewish question in Europe would be the creation of a Jewish state. And when I say in Europe, the main half of the Jews in the world at that time lived in the Russian Empire. 2/3 of the Jews in the world at that time lived in the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, and they lived in an area, Galicia and the areas around there, overlapping various nation states today, where there were many nationalities. Now, the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was a German-speaking Jew who wrote for a newspaper in Vienna, who was born in Budapest, in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in this area, there were, I have a list of all the nationalities here, not all, there were, of course, Russians, including the Russian state, Ukrainians, also known as Ruthenians at that time, Poles, Germans, Hungarians, Romanians, Romani or Gypsies, and Jews, all living in overlapping communities with their own languages and culture. And the Jews, of course, didn't speak national languages because they spoke, they had to talk to their neighbors, but they spoke Yiddish, which is a form of German that they had brought with them when they emigrated from the Rhinelands to the Polish Commonwealth in the 16th century, I think. So this was at the time, of course, like World War I, so on, when all of these empires are disintegrating and nationalist movements are growing. So I read a book by Omar Bartov, who is a leading scholar of Holocaust and genocide at Brown University, about the town of Buchach, where his family comes from originally in Galicia. I think it's now in Ukraine. It used to be Poland. Well, the same story. And it was also the hometown of the author Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature when I was a senior in high school, the first Hebrew writer to do that. And I translated some of his book at the time. And I've also read his reminiscences about the time. And if you read about Buchach at the time that Agnon was growing up there, you see there are Polish nationalist groups that formed armed groups, there are Ukrainian nationalist groups formed armed groups, there's the Russian army, there's the Austrian army. Nearby, there were Hungarians trying to get independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. And all of these movements had elements of anti-Semitism in them, and there was, of course, violence and so it was an environment that was a great incubating place for ethno-nationalism. And essentially, Zionism was another version of that same ethno-nationalism that was common to all those people in that area, with the exception that they all had territorial claims, of course, conflicting territorial claims. The Jews had no territory there. So, and because of various reasons, which I assume you're all aware of in culture and history, they eventually settled on trying to set up a Jewish state in Palestine, which I should emphasize was they had nothing, Zionism had nothing to do with the Middle East originally. They didn't know, when they say Palestine, this was a Palestine which had a great presence in their history and culture, but had nothing to do with 2 or 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which were inhabited by mainly by Arab-speaking Muslims and Christians. But the only way they could get access to it was after the British defeated the Ottoman Empire in World War I. And then the Middle East was carved up, just as Africa was carved up in the Conference of Berlin into these nation states as late stage colonialism. And as part of that, Britain was given a mandate over Palestine, which included encouraging Jewish immigration for various reasons. Now, so this is how, and this is the point of my article, that's how this ethno-nationalist movement from Eastern Europe became linked up with Western colonialism. Now, what does this movement mean today? What is Zionism? Well, there are people, for instance, you'll see an interview, parts of an interview with someone named Avram Borg, who was, his father was the head of the National Religious Party in Israel, although that party was quite different then from what it is now. And he was the speaker of the Knesset. And he says, not in what I'll be projecting, but in other statements, that the word Zionism is now anachronistic. Zionism was a movement to establish a Jewish state. There is a Jewish state. Okay, so you can be for it, you can be against it, you can oppose its policies, you can say it should change its structure, this, that, but it's there. There's no need for a movement for a Jewish state. But what it has become, what Zionism has turned into, of course, it has many, many different currents. But given that there is, of course, a resistance movement in opposition to the Jewish state, Zionism has become an international advocate for strengthening that state and strengthening its Jewish character. And Zionism has moved, obviously, nothing you don't know, increasingly in the direction of being an exclusivist, ethno-nationalist state. And for instance, just to give you a concrete example, Herzl established, in the Zionist organization, established something called the Jewish National Fund, which was designed to collect money from Jews worldwide. And its main job was to buy land in Palestine where Jews could settle. Now, buying land in a previously feudal country is not as simple as it sounds. People say they bought the land legally. Well, of course, what they actually did was they bought the land from the absentee landlords who were living in Beirut, and then the peasants who had traditional rights, they kicked them off the land so they could build their settlements, but they didn't understand that. I mean, same thing happened in India and other places where the colonial power imposed taxation regimes. But it was designed, in other words, to purchase land for a people that didn't have land, because Jews were not agricultural in Europe. But after the Nakba in 1948, of course, 750,000 or so Palestinians left. Israel did not allow them back in, and all their property was there. So they passed a law called the absentee property law, which expropriated all the property of the absent Palestinian refugees, and it's still being used today. And put much of it under the administration, especially the land, of the Jewish National Fund. So and then the Jewish National Fund, according to its statute, has to use all the property it has for Jews only. Okay, so what started out as a way for a deprived group to get an asset that it didn't have turned into an instrument for strengthening a kind of apartheid regime. And that's one of the ways, in which even the Arab citizens of Israel are second-class status, because the legal regime over land ownership and many other things is governed by the Jewish National Fund, not by the government of Israel, which in any case does not have a Bill of Rights or anything like that. Now, ethno-nationalism, just to be a political scientist for a moment, in political science, it's contrasted with civic nationalism. The idea, of course, we live in a world where the basic political unit is a nation state, but political doctrines underlying these nation states are different. Ethno-nationalism is the idea that, which I think Christian Herder perhaps invented, it was part of the unification of the German state, that humanity is divided into nations or races, each of which can realize its potential only by having its own state, its own land, government, and so on, to develop its language and character. So citizenship in those is closely tied to membership in an ethnicity, and therefore, by definition, there is some degree of inequality for ethnic minorities. How much and in what way varies a great deal. Now, the opposing concept is civic nationalism, which is that a nation state is a territorial community, and the citizens are the people who live there who live there legally, and they all have the same rights regardless of ethnicity. They of course can have different civil society, different civil society organizations and so on. Now, just one of the things that happened to the Jewish community is that, as I said, like 2/3 of the Jews were living in this area of Eastern Europe. Of course, now half the population of Israel is composed of the descendants of Jews who lived in Muslim countries. But at that time, of course, and that is the area where the Holocaust wiped out those whole entire communities. But that's also the area where my ancestors came from, and most of the ancestors of Jews in America came from. And in fact, at the same time that Herzl was inventing Zionism, the main movement among Jews, there was a socialist movement, communist movement, but the main movement was not really political. It was get out of it and come to America. And America's gates were open at that time. The tier was open and so on. And the Jews found great protection in civic nationalism and civil rights. You could trace that within the United States. So the American Jewish community was largely based on civic nationalism. Eventually, as Zionism established the state of Israel and so on, the two became blended in a blend which is uncomfortable sometimes and increasingly so. I just want to add that the establishment of the state of Israel was, of course, in reaction to anti-Semitism of Nazis and the Holocaust and so on. But it was also very significantly in reaction to the anti-Semitism of the United States and other Western countries, because the Jews fleeing the Nazis could not enter the United States because it had restrictive anti-Semitic immigration legislation, as did the UK. And therefore, instead, they were the Jews that were sent to Palestine. Most of the people who went to Palestine weren't necessarily ideological Zionists. They went there because that was the place they could go. And then the nation state was built up. So, there's kind of a joint history of, background to the origin of the state of Israel. Now, as I mentioned, there's this uneasy mix of ethno-nationalism for Israel, civic nationalism for the United States, among the Jewish community in the United States. There are many different currents, but what has happened is that the war in Gaza and the information about the war in Gaza has had an impact, which has created a significant disturbance within the American Jewish community and the world Jewish community, both between Israel and the diaspora, between generations, between different currents of thought. And what I want to show you is some examples of that disturbance. Now, first, I want to show you this video. I'll tell you when to start, because just one parenthetics note. Of course, we're talking about Palestine and genocide that's going on in Palestine. However, there are not going to be any Palestinian voices in this, because this is about its impact on some of whom are committing this genocide. Now, I just wanted to give a perspective on why focus on them and not solely on the ones who are being victimized, by showing you a short conversation between Iqbal Ahmed, who is a Pakistani intellectual and leftist who lived on the Upper West Side of New York. And he, as a young man, he actually went to Algeria to support the Algerian liberation movement, and knew Frantz Fanon, which you'll be talking about, with Edward Said, who is in this video. He's just sitting silently to the side. So please go ahead and run it.
When Fanon was working as a psychiatrist in a French hospital, he started treating victims of French torture. He also started treating the torturers. And there is that appendix in Wretched of the Earth, which sort of half tells that story. Hearing the stories, examining the psyche of the torturer and the tortured, transformed him as an individual. Because what he discovered in that relationship were 3 or 4 things. One was how injurious relationship of domination is, both to the dominator and to the dominated, to the victim and the victimizer.
Okay, so now we're going to have a series of videos in which Jews, all of them male, unfortunately, that's my fault, are discussing the damage they think is done to them and their culture by having become victimizers. Okay, now, this first person, Shaul Magid, is currently a distinguished resident fellow in Jewish studies at the Harvard Divinity School. He had a long position in Dartmouth, and he's one of the most important Jewish religious thinkers. And this particular segment is not about Gaza. It's about how he came to break with Zionism earlier. Just to give you the background, he is from New York suburbs, and he grew up in a completely secular environment, not religious. But when he was like 18 years old, he underwent a conversion and became ultra-Orthodox, which again, that's not Zionist. But then he moved to Israel to study in the yeshivas there, the madrasas, Jewish madrasas, and thought he would settle there, got married there. And at one point, he and his wife were actually thinking of relocating, moving to a settlement. And in fact, one place they visited at that time was the settlement of Gush Katif in Gaza. And this section starts with him talking about that.
We used to actually go to Gaza fairly frequently, to the beach. It was to Gush Katif. It was, it's a magnificently beautiful place, and just the sand, the air, there's everything was certainly magical from somebody who came from this, the New York suburbs. And I went to daven on Kabbalat Shabbat. I went to daven on Friday night, and looking out the window of the srif of the small kind of synagogue, it was magnificent. But I happened, we were looking toward the sunset, and I happened to see a Gazan, Palestinian Gazan, who was just on a horse-drawn carriage going home from the market or whatever. And I realized that there was something that was missing in that kind of beautiful scenario. And what was missing is what, in a certain sense, the Arabs that were living there were just not part of the story. They were not part of the future. They existed there the way the flora and fauna existed there, but there was no real recognition from these people who were incredibly generous and incredibly, forthcoming, and incredibly spiritual, that there's another people there, and those people have lives, and those people have been living there. Many of them have been living there since they were, expelled from Israel in 1948, or left by their own volition, however they left. So I there was a crack in my Zionism at that moment. There was a fissure that opened up that never really closed, that said to me, there's something about this project that doesn't make sense to me, given where I came from and the world that I grew up in. And I stayed with it for years after that, but that fissure never really healed. It just kind of widened over time. And it really kind of came to a breaking point when I served in the IDF in 1989 during the first Intifada. And I was a Shlav Betnik, for those of you people who are a little older and they have kids, so they actually go to the army for a shorter period of time. And I was doing basic training and then service in an army base near Nablus. And just being around there in the base, walking through Palestinian towns, having children look at you with hatred, you get this sense that you are a dominator, that you are dominating this other people, and they hate you because you're dominating them. You're controlling their lives. And in a certain sense, if there was a moment that was a break in my own sign of Zionism, it was that moment. I think that, as I think I say in the book, I didn't lose my Zionism at a left-wing protest. I lost my Zionism in the IDF during the first Intifada.
Okay, now I just want to just highlight something that probably didn't strike any of you as special, but he said they hated us because we were dominating them. Now, a very dominant discourse among Jews is that we are victims. We are victims of anti-Semitism. In fact, the journalist Gidon Levy for Haaretz has said that the Israeli occupation of these territories It's not the worst occupation in history, but it is the only occupation where the occupier claims to be the victim. And not only that, claims to be the only victim. Okay, but so by saying that they hate us because we're dominating them, not because they're anti-Semites or something like that, he is making a break with a psychological frame which is very deep in our community. Okay, so now this is Yuval Harari, Yuval Noah Harari. You may know him. He's written a number of best-selling popular history books like Sapiens, Homo Deus, more recently Nexus. He's extraordinarily prolific. And here he's asked, what is the impact of Gaza on Jewish history? Something like that. Here, listen.
I think it's could be one of the biggest turning points in Jewish history, maybe the biggest since the fall of the temple in 70 CE, since the Roman conquest, because Judaism has survived. It became the world champion in surviving catastrophes, but it never faced a catastrophe like we are dealing with right now, which is a spiritual catastrophe for Judaism itself. Because what is happening right now in Israel could basically, I think, destroy, void 2,000 years of Jewish thinking and culture and existence. We can talk later about how to prevent it, but we should be clear about what we are facing if Israel continues on its present trajectory. The disintegration of Israeli democracy and the creation of a new Israel, which is based on an ideology of Jewish supremacy and on the worship of what were completely anti-Jewish values for the last 2 millennia. A country based on the worship of power and violence.
Okay, so I want to mention a couple of points here. First of all, his reference to history. You'll find he referred to the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, I don't know how many of you were, I'm going to repeat something that some of you certainly know, but just the background. In Jewish history, there was the first temple built by King Solomon, or Prophet Suleiman, in Jerusalem, which was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, when they conquered Jerusalem and took the people into exile in Mesopotamia and Persia. Then under King Cyrus of Persia, they were able to return, not to build their own state, but to live in peace and rebuild the temple. And that temple endured through the Hellenistic period. Alexander covered the area, and then the Roman period. But then there was starting in 66 CE, there was an uprising against the Roman Empire by the Jews in Palestine, an anti-imperialist Palestinian uprising by the Jews, which ended with the Romans coming and destroying that temple. And that led to eventual exile of most of the Jews who were living in Palestine at that time. Now, what he is referring to is, he is saying, I have said this in my writing, and you will see it mentioned again here, is that, you see, we refer to those periods as Habayit HaRishon, the first temple, the first house, Beit, if you know Arabic, Habayit HaSheni, the second temple, and the state of Israel is Habayit HaShlishi. There's no temple yet, although some of the fanatics in the government are talking about rebuilding it where Al-Aqsa is. But people are starting to talk about, very few, it's a minority. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming this is sweeping over the whole Jewish community, but Yuval Harari is not some marginal person. He's a professor of history at Hebrew University and a best-selling author. And are starting to talk about this as a catastrophe that could lead to the destruction of the Third Commonwealth. Because of precisely what he said, it represents the destruction of what have been Jewish values for 2,000 years. Now, next, Mandy Patinkin. Now, you may know Mandy Patinkin as the actor who played the director of Central Intelligence in Homeland, Saul. You may also know him as the actor who played Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride. What you may not know about him is that he is also a scholar and performer of Yiddish music. And he has played an important role in, the discovery and revival of Yiddish culture. So here he is being interviewed about Gaza.
And I ask Jews all over the world to consider what this man, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his right-wing government is doing to the Jewish people all over the world. They are endangering not only the state of Israel, which I care deeply about and want to exist, but they are endangering the Jewish population all over the world. He is the most dangerous thing, not just since October 7th. It has been a deeply troubled situation.
And endangering the Jews by endangering
Yes.
those in Gaza.
And to watch what is happening for the Jewish people, to allow this to happen to children and civilians of all ages in Gaza, for whatever reason, is unconscionable and unthinkable. And I ask you Jews everywhere, all over the world, to spend some time alone and think, is this acceptable and sustainable? How could it be done to you and your ancestors, and you turn around and you do it to someone else?
Okay, well, I think that requires no further explanation. Next, Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart will appear. He'll speak for himself here. He will appear later because some of these are excerpts from interviews that he has done in his podcast. Peter Beinart is former editor of the New Republic, but he was author of a book called The Crisis of Liberal Zionism. He's recently published a book called Judaism After Gaza, and is one of the leading voices, I would say, I don't know if I would say of anti-Zionism, of non-Zionism, of certainly deep, as you'll see, deep criticism of the state of Israel and what it represents and the importance of solidarity with Palestinians in the United States. He's a professor of journalism at City University. He himself is an practicing Orthodox Jew who goes to the synagogue regularly, as he will say, and keeps the laws. Please go ahead.
So last week in synagogue, many Jews, including myself, read Torah portion called Amor, which comes from the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, as Jews call it. And it includes this line, do not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelites. And from this line, that essentially what Jews do is a kind of referendum on the nature of God itself, that God's reputation is sullied, is desecrated when Jews behave badly. One is actually bringing God's self into disrepute, which is why this is such a profound sin, to the extent that in Tractate Yoma in the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that there is no atonement for the sin of Chilul Hashem, that how could what's happening in Gaza not possibly be a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, on a magnitude, on a scale that I simply struggle every day to comprehend.
Okay, so he is saying, he's identified the sin, Chilul Hashem, desecration of the name. Because he says Israel is carrying out the sin that cannot be atoned for in Gaza and the West Bank, most serious sin that there is. I'm mentioning this because the same thing, Chilul Hashem, will be mentioned by other speakers as well. Okay. Now, go back to the title. Okay, so next is Rabbi Ismar Shorsh. He was interviewed by Peter Beinart. Ismar Shorsh was the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, a few blocks from my house. The Jewish Theological Seminary is the institution for training of rabbis in the conservative movement, which is, it has nothing to do with conservative, meaning of the word conservative in today's Washington, D.C., but in conservative Judaism, which, according to a quick Google search I did before coming here, represents approximately 17% of the American Jewish population. Therefore, just want to emphasize, this is not a marginal figure. This is someone at the center of Jewish culture, education, and religious practice in the United States. And he's in his 80s now. He himself was born in Nazi Germany and came to the United States as a child. Here's what he has to say.
There is an incredibly powerful image in the prophet Ezekiel. In chapter 10 of Yechezkel, he portrays the departure of God from the temple. God exits slowly because God is still hoping that he will be re-embraced. But there are no willing takers. God leaves the temple. And of course, the symbolism is that when the deity is no longer in the sanctuary can be destroyed. I think that in some ways, Judaism is at that critical moment. Are we going to be able to defend Judaism, which has the burden of the Chilul Hashem taking place on the West Bank and on Gaza? Will we be able to live that Judaism? And if we don't speak out now, it may be too late. This may be our final moment until.
Okay, so that he's saying this again, this could be the destruction of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people, so, similarly to the destruction of the Second Temple. That's extremely unimaginably serious thing for such a prominent rabbi from a mainstream group to say. Now, the next person you're going to see is someone from a marginal group. Rabbi Elhanan Beck is a member of the sect of Neturei Karta, who are ultra-Orthodox sect in Jerusalem and in Westchester County. And I knew about them when I was growing up. We made fun of them because they, of course, they would throw rocks at people who were driving on the streets on the Sabbath and at women who had short sleeves. They were kind of Taliban-like in that respect. And also, they were against Zionism because they said the Jewish people that will return to the land of Israel only when God decrees it. God decreed the exile, and they will return only when God decrees it. And it is a violation of the religion for people to take that into their own hands to do. Now, of course, that's what is known as quietism. And, in the environment in which I grew up, it wasn't even particularly continued. I mean, everybody was against quietism, whether you were Zionist or a liberal or because nobody, I just thought the idea that you should just wait for God to solve problems was very reactionary, and I never really listened to them, and I never met any of them. I met some of them now because they turn out at the demonstrations about Gaza. And I try to talk to them. They're not that interested in talking to me, I must say. But I try to talk to them. And what they say, it surprised me. What they say is not that different from what a lot of other people are saying, except that they have a religious way of framing it. And I think they make a lot of sense. So listen to him.
In today's day, where is the most dangerous place for Jewish people? Go all around the world. All the world, you will come to one point, the middle of the world. It's the state of Israel. It is the most dangerous place for Jewish people. Jews live peacefully here in England. I live in England already 36 years. I don't know how an English soldier looks like. I never saw them. In Israel, every small child knows all the weapons, all the soldiers, tanks, all military vehicles. This is safeness. This is the most dangerous place for the Jewish people. 7th of October didn't start on 7th of October. It started in 1948 on the 15th of May. It started by the Nakba for the Palestinians. This happened when they want to cover up their killings, the genocide, with more killings. When you control a people, a large amount of people, of 2 million people, when to have electricity, when not, when to have water, and when not. This is the outcome. Zionism is basically built up on mistrusting God. Don't believe in God. Don't trust God. From the other side, Judaism is built up on trusting in God. The state of Israel is a rebellion against God, and they will not succeed. They will come to an end. A person who can justify genocide, a person who can commit genocide, I can't count him as a Jew. People who justify genocide, they are more Nazis than Jews.
Yeah, as you see, he has just violated the International Holocaust Memorial definition of anti-Semitism by comparing Israel to Nazis, and therefore he is an anti-Semite and not eligible for lecturing at universities in the United States. At any rate, now, next, we're going to hear from Avram Borg. Now, I put this in writing because he had so many things to say, I couldn't get all the clips, but Avram Borg, whom you will see shortly, is the son of the former head of the National Religious Party in Israel. That was the Religious Zionist Party. But as he says in parts of the interview that I'm not playing, in 1967, his father was in the cabinet, and he voted against the occupation of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Earlier, he was one of 2 people in the cabinet who voted against the execution of Adolf Eichmann, because otherwise Israel did not have the death penalty, the judicial death penalty. And, he goes on at length, talks about the type of religion his father. Now, he himself was not a member of the National Religious Party. He was in the Labor Party, and he rose quite high, and he became the Speaker of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, at one time. But he has emerged as one of the most thoughtful, maybe critics is too mild a word. Now, what you're going to see is parts of his interview with Peter Beinart. He's going to start out speaking in Hebrew. Well, no, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about this. Okay. He's going to refer to this proposal in the interview. His proposal is, you can read it, to get 1 million Jews to sign a petition to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to file a complaint against the state of Israel for crimes against humanity committed in our name under the false banner of Jewish identity. In other words, he wants to start a process by which Jews can show their opposition to the state of Israel through international law. Now, let me say something about international law. He also pointed out structures of international law that we have, and in particular, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, are basically invented by Jews, after World War II, and were adopted in order to prevent repetition of the Holocaust. So, in his view, one of the most important obligations of a Jew is to uphold this international human rights law, including when it is applied to Israel, and not to make Israel an exception. In other words, he says in this, Jews can commit crimes just like anyone else. Whatever chosen means, it doesn't mean that they have some moral privilege or exempt from anything. Now, recently, he has written two documents in Hebrew, probably more, but two that you'll hear parts of here. One of them, he wrote a Kaddish for the High Holy Days. As you may know, the last 2 days were Rosh Hashanah, and in 7 more days it will be Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a time of year when Jews are supposed to look introspectively and examine themselves for sin and apologize to people and so on. And he has written a special Kaddish. Now, Kaddish is a prayer which is usually said, which is said by mourners over the dead, but it's not actually about that. It's a prayer of sanctification of the name of God, that same name which is being profaned, according to those other speakers. And he has written a special Kaddish for Rosh Hashanah of this year. Now, you'll see him, I'm reciting a few of it in Hebrew because I just want you to get the feeling of him, and then Peter Barnett will read excerpts of it in English.
מתגדלים ומתקדשים אך אלה, יצרם של מסיתים, הררי הריסות ושורות הקברים, צרחות האימה והשתיקה הכפויה, לא תהא גדולה בחורבות שכונה רתומה, בזעקת ילד בחשיכות חייו, בבכייה של אימא המחממת בשדיה הריקים את גופות ילדיה, אין קדושה בדם הזה, אין גדולה בשכול הזה, ומי יאמר קדיש אחר.
So I will read now in, I'll read in English, I'll read the entire thing in English. Yitgadal v'yikadashim merabah, may his great name be magnified and sanctified. Not great and not holy is he, for in his name blood is spilled in vain. Magnified and sanctified are only these, the impulse of inciters and destroyers, the heaps of ruin and the rows of graves, the cries of terror and the silence imposed. No great fear, a kingdom of burned toys and withered childhoods, its corpse laid in endless rows. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, you and your kingdom were seized by angels of destruction, and no one called to them, enough. Do not lay your hands to the fire and to the slaughtering knife. Of course.
Walk with me as shoulder to shoulder, as the old Marxists are saying.
Okay,
about marching in order.
Marching shoulder to shoulder to do that.
Jews to take a position against what's going on here. Maybe it's these will be the high holidays of the Declaration of Independence of diaspora Jewry from the enslavement of the last 80 years to uber nationalism and uber sovereigntism.
Of course.
Walk with me as the destruction of the first temple brought to the world prophecy. The destruction of the second temple brought to the world the rabbinical Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Judaism. And I can go on and on what happened after the expulsion from Spain, how eventually it led to the Sfat Kabbalah and later on to the Hasidut and the excitement of Hasidut, and. So yes, we are living in terrible, troubled, confusing, perplexing times of destruction and ruin. But I already feel the pregnancy of new Judaism coming to life out of it, ours.
Now, I didn't really mean to end on such a positive note. And again, I emphasize, on the one hand, these people with these views are very far from being a majority, but they also are not, marginal people with no standing or something. And there are more and more of them. There's many others that I didn't manage to put up here, for lack of time. But now I want to just make one last comment. This presentation has been about the effect of Gaza and the genocide there and the violence that preceded us on some Jewish thinkers. But Zionism is not solely a Jewish phenomenon. And ethno-nationalism is by no means a Jewish phenomenon. And the disturbance in people's conceptions is much broader than just among Jews. You know, and the fact that, I mean, you've heard this before, I'm going to repeat it. Okay. The fact that a genocide can be live streamed without provoking a reaction from great powers, or even the great powers will support it, we all see it, is a manifestation of the decay and disappearance of international human rights law and humanitarian law, which, as I said, was largely invented by Jews. I mean, and the United States, for instance, I said this to one of my former employees over coffee this morning. The United States used to play a very important role as an inconsistent and hypocritical champion of international law and human rights. It no longer does that. It's a wrecker. Okay. And that didn't start only with Trump. It didn't start only with Biden either, but you know, but of course, I don't mean to make this just about Trump. It applies in a different way to Biden as well. Now, why is this happening? My hypothesis, my theory is that it's partly a reaction in the United States. It's a reaction to the fear that white people will become a minority. Already, a majority of the students in elementary schools in the United States are non-white. And you know, you're familiar with the Great Replacement theory and so on. So this has led to a revival of white supremacy. And I'll get to the role of anti-Semitism in a minute. And then globally, obviously there's a shift in power and a change in the orientation of different kinds of powers toward the international human rights system. For instance, take the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. For many years, the International Criminal Court was criticized because it only pursued cases against Africans, and then against Milosevic and others who were pariahs to the Western world. And the cases were started by Western governments and so on. Now, Brazil, South Africa, Brazil, and so on have taken Israel to that court. The United States has put them under sanctions, and I just read the other day that the United States is planning to put entity sanctions on the entire International Criminal Court. So everyone who works for it will be under sanctions. Oh, I forgot to talk about South Park. Well, we can talk about that later. Let me just end with this, and that one of the really peculiar things that is happening here is that in the United States, President Trump actually is doing something that he always says he's, very creative and accomplishes things no one has ever done before. Well, I'm going to tell you something that he's done that no one has ever done before. He is building a fascist regime which is legitimized by the fight against anti-Semitism. Nobody ever thought of doing that before. Okay. And that puts Jews in a very difficult position. And it guarantees that these disturbances will continue. I'm not going to, it's not the first time that the Jewish question has been used as a spearhead to establish new forms of authoritarianism in the West in particular. And I'm not going to predict what happened or make any policy recommendations other than resistance. But I wanted to expose those of you who come here today and those of you who may be listening to trends of thought and feeling and belief within the Jewish community, within my community, that you may not be aware of, that do not get public attention, and that are not marginal or insignificant voices, even though they are far from being the majority. Thank you.
Okay, we have to talk to questions and answers. I'm going to pose the first question, and we'll open up to the floor. to the audience. How do you respond, Barnett, to the argument that you are engaging in gross overreach in the videos that you played by suggesting that somehow the policies of the state of Israel produce a moral stain on Judaism itself, somehow implying that Netanyahu and his government is the embodiment or a reflection of Judaism? The comparison would be the Taliban in Afghanistan. Are the policies of the Taliban in Afghanistan a moral stain on Islam? Are the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran a moral stain on Islam? I'm a Muslim. What those political leaders do in no way reflect the type of Islam that I understand and practice. There seems to be some sort of an equivalency here that raises serious questions about your argument. Because when you look at other cases in other religious traditions, I don't think the argument holds. Taliban, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Islam. How would you respond to that comparison?
First of all, it is not my argument. That wasn't me on the screen.
Okay.
Those are actual real people, including the former president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And, the Taliban are quite marginal in the international Muslim community. Iran, less so, but still, it's a political phenomenon. The case of Israel, which claims to represent, the state of Israel says that it is the state of the entire Jewish people. And currently, it has people who justify what it's doing on the basis of biblical references and religious commandments. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that's what Judaism is. Any religion is composed of many texts, traditions, and discourses, and you can only say what religion actually is if you are a strong believer that God has determined that religion is one thing or another. As a more secular person or a social scientist, a religion is the totality of the social practices and beliefs of the people that belong to that community, to put it simply, which changes over time, which is politically contested. And you've just seen that process here. I think it would be, from my point of view, you see, Elchanan Beck, the guy from the Torah Karta, he said that Zionists are not Jews. That's what the Torah Karta says. I don't agree with that, because I don't think that there is a metaphysical definition of who is a Jew. Jewish identity is a social phenomenon, and it includes people who identify themselves as Jews, who are identified by others as Jews, who use Jewish discourse, and so on. And of course, there are no clear boundaries. So, and in fact, there are reasons based in the Jewish religion and in Jewish historical experience for the ideology of Zionism and the establishment of the state of Israel. That's what I started out talking about. I mean, that very article that you mentioned about Zionist relation to colonialism. When I first published it, I sent it to a bunch of people I knew. And one of them was a Palestinian woman who worked for the Norwegian embassy in Saudi Arabia. And I met her in Riyadh when I was on a diplomatic mission there. And we stayed in touch. And most of her family is in Gaza. They originate from Ramla, in what is today inside the state of Israel, from which they were all expelled in 1948 and at gunpoint. And then they went to Gaza, which at that time was occupied by the Egyptian army. Many of her family, of course, have been killed in the current war. Obviously, many, well, I didn't mention October 7th, but many Jews have been killed by a terrorist attack as well. And, you know, many Palestinians were killed long before October 7th, and Jews were killed by other terrorist attacks and resistance activities for many decades. Okay, so, but when she read the article, she didn't have your reaction. She said, I'm tired of hearing about the Holocaust. What about what's actually happening to the Palestinians today? And I said to her, this article was not written for you. This article was written for people more like me, with a background that predisposed them to have some sympathy or empathy with the project of Israel and Zionism as a response to the oppression of Jews, and to explain how, independent of our volition, given the political context in which we did it, it became entangled with colonialism. Right? Israel was created in 1948, which was also the beginning of decolonization. You know, there was the violence of the Nakba. It wasn't only happening in Palestine and Israel in 1948. There was an equal or similar violence in the Indian subcontinent when India was partitioned between India and Pakistan, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, millions of people were killed. There were such events in the Balkans. Of course, we know what's going on during World War II. So at the time, Stalin was deporting whole nationalities that he claimed and putting them in concentration camps, which he claimed were agents of foreign influence. So it was a very violent time of reckoning. The question is, how do we deal with it afterwards? So I would never say myself that what Israel is doing is discrediting Judaism. Well, first, I'm not a religious thing. I'm not even a religious person, really. I mean, probably I am in some way, but never mind that. We'll just this for another discussion. But these people are. Okay. That is what it appears to them. That this state, which claims to represent them, is misrepresenting them. Is desecrating the name of God. And they are concerned what this will do to the future of their own people. Now, at the end, Avram Borg says he sees some new developments coming out. You know, some people argue that. Naomi Wolf, a Canadian Jewish writer, wrote about something about that in the Nation magazine. You know, this new Judaism that's being produced. But someone wrote a letter to it saying the future of Judaism will be more determined by the birth rates of the ultra-Orthodox than by what happens on the Upper West Side of New York and in demonstrations, which, you know, there's a lot of sense in that. You know, and Harari, in a part that I did not choose, he says, the state of Israel can survive. It's strong militarily, it has the political support of the United States, technology, et cetera, but its survival will be at the cost of what he, at least, and I and many others consider to be Jewish values. So again, they're not, you know, that's what are Jewish values? Those are in dispute. That dispute is the religion.
Great, thank you. Okay, the floor is open for questions, comments.
Do we need to do the expression statement?
Oh yeah, we have a freedom of expression statement here, Barnett at Georgetown, that before we can take a question, we have to read the policy. Go ahead.
Thank you for coming to this session. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that audience members may not share the views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event will respect the right of the speaker and the organizing department to share their perspectives and ideas and not cause a disruption. There will now be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question And in the interest of time, we ask that people only ask one question.
The floor is open. Hagar.
Hi, very good to see you. What do you think is the impact of this not so mainstream, but also not marginal voices like yourself, Peter, the rest of them? Because I think the public opinion, so this is all what can shape public opinion. Public opinion on Israel has shifted both in the US, I would say, across the West, and obviously in the global South, which was always more realistic. But I don't think policy has changed in any way, if not gotten worse. You mentioned Biden, now Trump is just US policy towards the region, and Gaza, Israel, Palestine is worse. And I don't know if there are any prospects for change. And we know US policy, like you said, US support for Israel is what has kept us going and will let this happen. As long as that support, military support, financial support, diplomatic support, UN Security Council vetoes, all of that, as long as that remains, that US thumb on the scale, I don't think things can actually change on the ground, no matter how much resistance, what shape and form it takes. But do you think this change of rhetoric and opinion will have impact on policy eventually?
Look, I don't want to engage in political prognostication. I was trying to educate you about cultural and political currents. I'll just say about change in policy that normally you can predict the policy tomorrow by extrapolating the policy today. I'm not sure that's true of Donald Trump. Netanyahu should probably speak to some plumbers who worked for Trump in New Jersey, who never got paid. Of course, obviously there are internal political reasons for it, ideological, I don't know if we could say ideological about Trump. So I'm not predicting anything as a result of this. I don't know. It is what I will predict is that if you're just talking about American politics, there is a genuine shift within the Democratic Party, which is primarily along generational lines, and within Jews in the United States, primarily along generational lines. It already had an effect. There's some analysis that Kamala Harris might have won if she had taken a different position on Gaza. I mean, it's hard to prove these counterfactuals. Clearly the effect in Michigan, there was an impact of abstention by Arab Americans and so on. I don't want to make too much out of all of this. But right now it's contributing to the disarray inside the Democratic Party, which contrasts quite dramatically with the authoritarian control under the leader of the Republican Party, so that the Democratic base is now largely against its own leaders in Congress, not only on this issue, but on others as well. And I'm from New York. We have Mahmoud Zamdani is campaigning. Zoran Mamdani. Mahmoud Mamdani is his father, whom I know. That's why I made that mistake. He was a professor at Columbia when I was a professor at Columbia, and I was doing some work on Rwanda and Burundi one time and talked to him about it. Anyway, and I know his mother, the filmmaker. So I don't know him. Anyway, so I'm not showing you this to say this is the wave of the future. I don't know. I doubt it. But there will be many waves, and this will be one of them.
Great. Okay. Yes.
So many of the Israelis now talk, of course, about the history of what it means to be Jewish, about the fact this is their land, that God gave them their land. At the same time, archaeology, Jewish archaeologists, and every Israeli I know is an archaeologist, that's part of kind of who they are. And so much of that comes into basically, where did the Jews come from? The same place the Canaanites came from. That there's a real, that there are two different languages that people are talking. I would like to think that they're listening to the archaeologists.
Look, as a social scientist, collective identities are historically contingent. The concept of a Jewish people is not something that has been unchanged over time. If you look at the genetic composition, different communities of Jews have different genetic compositions. Most of them have some element of Middle Eastern genetic material, but others as well, and you can reconstruct some of their migrations from that. But that doesn't matter, like the fact is, they said, okay, the Jews have always considered this to be their land. The Jewish people originated in their land. That is true. But considering something to be yours does not give you a property right over it. There are other people whose rights have to be taken into account as well. And generally speaking, we do not adjudicate rights on the basis of religious texts, which are not believed by a lot of people. So essentially saying that the United States international community should enforce Israel's exclusive control of Eretz Israel because, as one senator, I think it was Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, said as he was cross-examining President of Colombia at that time, because God said to Abraham, I will give this land to you, and those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. So the fact is, of course, we don't know that Abraham really existed. There's no proof that God, if he exists, actually said this to Abraham. So that's essentially asking for a Jewish theocracy to be imposed on the entire international system. And the whole basis of our living together in the inner world is that we don't impose any kind of theocracy on everybody by force. That's why we have international law and compromises. So of course, if you want to do that, it leads to what we are seeing today: violence and ultimately genocide, which you will consider to be divinely sanctioned. That's extremely dangerous. I might add that the current Minister of Finance in Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, who is the head of the National Religious Party, the much changed party that Avram Burg's father was the head of, gave a speech on what's called Jerusalem Day, which commemorates the capture of East Jerusalem by the Israeli army in 1967. And you can see it online. It's on the Middle East Eye website. He says in Hebrew and their English subtitle, he says, we are going to rebuild the temple soon in our days. And I have the budget for it. He said that. He said, I have the budget for it. He's the Minister of Finance. And there is a video circulating among the settlers now, which shows, it's an AI-generated video, which shows the explosion of Al-Aqsa and the Mosque of Omar on Haram Sharif, or Temple Mount, Har HaBayit in Jerusalem, and its replacement by a Greco-Roman building, which somehow is how they envisage the temple. And it shows the smoke from the animal sacrifices coming up. Now, I'm not predicting that will happen. I asked someone, I was at the conference organized by Macron on two-state solution in May, and Gershon Boskin was there, who lives in Jerusalem, and he specializes in the question of Jerusalem. And I said, how seriously should we take this? And he just said, we don't know. We don't know. We can't rule it out, but I wouldn't rule it in either. Again, there are reports that yesterday, or the last couple of days, there was a meeting at the UN of heads of state about how to solve Gaza. Trump presented a plan which supposedly was ending the war, Israeli withdrawal, some kind of international force, governance in Gaza without Hamas. I don't know, various things that are not genocidal in and of themselves. And it doesn't include anything about expelling all the population, which is what Israel apparently wants to do. So Trump does not have a very strong record of following up rhetoric with effective means, although although he always says that he succeeded in ending wars and doing that, but I don't know. Even if that is really what he proposed, I don't know that it will be implemented. But the biblical cultural belief is fine. You can respect the cultural belief, but it does not impose obligations on anybody else.
Great. Let's take 3 questions, then we'll wrap it up. Grace, then Jonathan, and I guess we might take one more. Okay, at the back. Yeah, okay, Maya. Grace, go ahead.
Thanks for your talk, Professor Rubin. My question is, in your Boston Review article, you talked about the origins of Zionism in socialist movements. Do you think that Zionism has any future in the left wing specifically?
Well, let me explain. Zionism did not originate in socialist movements. Herzl was not a socialist. And Zionism emerged as a reaction to the failure of liberalism, right? In particular, Herzl went to Paris during the Dreyfus Affair, and he saw that the homeland of emancipation of the Jews by the French Revolution was now being convulsed by anti-Semitism. Within this big community that I referred to in Russia, what was then Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a lot of political ferment, including many people who said they were social. And there's, of course, the socialists covered a whole range of things. And in my article, I start the article by just showing a picture of my wife's grandmother when here it is, taken in Komsomol-Podolsk, Ukraine in 1906. And and her friend here, whose name I don't know, is holding a publication in Yiddish, which says Del Nayovek, the new path. And Del Nayovek was the official organ of the Central Committee of the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, okay, which was banned by the Tsarist regime soon after this, okay. And they use the early Zionists used some socialist ideals about how do you settle the land. They didn't settle the land like Virginia was settled, by royal land grants followed by the importation of slaves. They got the land in various ways and later expropriated it through violence, and then they didn't try to turn the indigenous population into laborers and slaves. They wanted to form a Jewish state. Okay, so it was a different process. But at this point, see, at the time that we're talking about, late 19th century, the struggle against colonialism was growing, but decolonization had not started. And in fact, Herzl and the other Zionists had every reason to believe that it would be permanent. They didn't, that the British would continue to control Palestine through this arrangement. And it was the fact, so that in that historical context, it made more sense to pair Zionism with socialism or liberalism as institutional techniques for the settlement. But as the international political scene became more dominated by decolonization, and the definition of left shifted more toward supporting decolonization rather than, if white Southerners had formed kibbutzim they said, we're against slavery, so we won't employ any black people. We want them to leave. You know, and in fact, there was such a movement to, you know, to bring the blacks back to Africa. We wouldn't say that's a progressive movement. So today, given the evolution of the world scene and decolonization, the shift in international power, there is no way, you know, Zionism is compatible with liberalism or leftism. And, you know, and you can see in Israeli politics that the liberal and the left are virtually disappeared.
Maya?
Yes. From my understanding, it seems like the concept of diaspora, the story of exile is a very like important cultural part of Jewish culture and ritual and thinking. And so now, obviously, we have this Jewish state that is, I guess, a solution to this exile. Like Jews can return to Eretz Israel now, and but at the same time, this Jewish state, as all the speakers have expressed, as you expressed, is incredibly problematic for Jewish culture and thinking and this spirituality and whatnot. So, like, where does that leave this cultural part? Like, where does this leave this part of Jewish culture?
Well, of course, the most honest answer I could give is I don't know. And also that bear in mind, as I said before, the religion is the dispute. Okay. The religion is not a consensus. The religion is a dispute. It's a lot of disputes. I guess that's true of all religions. It's perhaps even more true of Judaism. What will be the direct, you know, young Jews in the United States are going in one direction. They're going in several directions, you know, toward assimilation, intermarriage, and then toward this new kind of progressive Judaism. Then, you know, the Orthodox population is, of course, increasing, and then there's modern. So I cannot say. And what these people are referring to is their idea of Jewish culture, which is very much an idea of Jewish culture that came out of Jewish European and American experience, you know, of Jewry, you know, because American Jewry has been protected by the civic nationalism of the United States. And that's why there was an affinity between organized American Jewry and the civil rights movement in its early stages, when it had not evolved into an anti-colonial Black liberation movement. And that is still why, you know, the Jewish vote in the United States is not determined. It's, you know, people say they have incomes like richest people, and they vote like Puerto Ricans. You know, and that is still a remnant from that. So, but that Jewish culture, which came out of Europe, Eastern Europe, and was part of it, not all of it by any means, was much less influential in the Jewish culture of the Middle East, where they have the seminal experience now is their expulsion from those countries in reprisal for the Nakba and the formation of the State of Israel. You know, so there's no one Jewish culture. It's changing. The question is, this is I think a new trend, which is articulated by some very influential people who are far from being majority. Where that will lead.
Did you have a question, Jonathan, or did you want me to read this?
Yeah, I had a question.
Go ahead.
So I read Charles McGee's book about Rav Kook and about how Rav Abraham Kook kind of created this heady mixture of belief that birthed religious Zionism, that reconciled Orthodox opposition to a state of Israel with the nation-state movement. And he, of course, died before the foundation of Israel. But when I read that, and this was actually before the genocide began, it was like maybe a year or two, I was struck that thought of Rav Abraham Kook had two like kind of distinct possibilities or pathways. One could be that it could actually form into an opposition to the continuation of the occupation because of the affront that the occupation serves towards those foundational Jewish values that Rav Abraham Kook was so deeply in love with. But the other was because of this justification of like kind of setting aside the Orthodox opposition and saying that the Orthodox opposition was itself keeping Jews held back, and that ironically the nation state was what was advancing the welfare of Jews. That's what led him to support the foundation of a nation state. And so it seems to me like Avram Berg is perhaps that stream of the former, and Smotrich and his ilk is the stream of the latter. And so what I wanted to ask is, so does Avram Berg is presumably in diaspora.
No,
he's in Israel.
Yeah.
So how is the if you look at religious Zionism as a whole within Israel, how much support does Avram Berg's interpretation have versus, like, it seems like kind of the perspective of Smotrich is the one that holds currency within the religious Zionism movement.
Well, without prejudging how much Smotrich, I mean, Berg is isolated, right? Like Gideon Levy. And if not for his background and the political stature that he had, he would be quite marginal. I mean, but people listen to him because of who his father was and because of his prominence in politics in the past, so he has some standing. But that view is vanishingly rare, I would say. Just to talk about, I don't know how much you want to hear about the Rav Kook. Look, first of all, Rav Kook's son is the leading rabbi of the settler movement. And he believes that the greatest commandment is settling the land of Israel, and that by fulfilling the commandments, Jews bring the Messiah. So the Judaism, the type of Judaism represented by today's National Religious Party is messianic. And it's based on an interpretation of the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria from the 17th century in Tzfat, which Borg referred to. Anyway, I won't go into all of that, but it has to do with how the actions of Jews shape cosmic history. That by the world is broken every time you repair. Every time a Jew fulfills a commandment, it helps repair the broken vessels, which is preparing the way for the return of the Messiah. So, and in fact, the Orthodox position on Zionism had before Avram Kook was pretty much what Dr. Karta, a rabbi, said. These are, atheists. A Zionist is an atheist who believes that God gave him the land of Israel. But he came up with a formulation under which the Zionists, despite their own intention, were actually carrying out God's will and God's plan of salvation.
Barney, this has been very educational for all of us. I think you've introduced us to important sort of currents of thought and debates within Judaism, within the Jewish community that certainly are encouraging at this dark moment. Where it's going to lead is an open question. But you've enriched our campus discussion on questions related to Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. So thank you for taking time to be with us today. Please join me in thanking Barnett.